Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for being here. EWA really appreciates your support, and we hope that you have found this conference useful so far, and we hope to continue that with the discussions we have up this afternoon. My name, for those of you who haven't met me already, my name is Kenneth Terrell, and I am the project director for EWA. I am responsible for most of the association's higher education programming. So planning events like this and other activities like our webinars and blogs and things like that. But in my previous life, I actually was an education journalist. I worked at U.S. News and World Report for many years and was the education editor there. So I enjoy the discussions like this morning's about the rankings and ratings and trying to figure out how to make sense of data in ways that are useful to families and students. But going very far back, my first full-time job in journalism was as a reporter for the Post-Standard newspaper in Syracuse, New York. And as working primarily as a general assignment reporter, so, chasing police cars and all other sorts of chaos. But when I did have spare time, my actual beat was Syracuse University. So that's part of what brought this subject to mind, the subject that we're going to discuss now to mind for me, that as I began working on that beat, there was a very clear split between what I was supposed to be covering as the education reporter on the Syracuse University beat and what the sports team was doing covering Syracuse University because, Syracuse is a pretty middle-sized town these days, so the university is basically their pro sports teams and it gets a lot of attention in that regard. But trying to balance the two beats can be very challenging. But it's also something that, from my own experience and then also just following recent developments in the news, I really want to encourage all of you to begin to explore more. As we know from our discussion earlier today on sexual assaults on campus, many times it is the athletes who are involved in those incidents, and that's something that as an education reporter, you should be engaged in those discussions. That's not something you should just leave to the sports team to figure out. With concerns about the NCAA and whether or not should they begin paying students or should they be compensating them differently than they are. I mean, these are all issues that as education reporters you should be weighing in on and trying to be a part of those discussions, even if it's just sitting in on your newsrooms, the sports teams educate their beat. Go to their beat meetings, be a part of the conversation, try to find ways to work with them because these are very vital stories to you also as the education reporter. So we have some experts here today who are going to give you advice on what education reporters should know about covering college sports. To my left, we have Paul Ward, who is one of our hosts at SMU. He is Vice President for Legal Affairs, General Counsel, and Secretary to the Board of Trustees here, and he's been in this position since 2009. He oversees legal services to the university. As secretary, he works closely with the president and senior administrative officers in coordinating the board's activities. And he serves as an adjunct faculty member to the Caldwell-Simmons School of Education and Human Development. Prior to coming to SMU, he was vice president for university administration and general counsel at Arizona State University and general counsel to the University of South Carolina System. And he also worked in private practice. So he'll share some of his insights with us. To his left, we have Jodi Upton, who is a senior database editor at USA Today, where her team supports breaking news stories, longer projects, and everything in between, as well as data-driven interactives. She was a John S. Knight Fellow at Stanford University and is a visiting scholar at Indiana University's National Sports Journalism Center. And to my far left, we have Amy Perko, who is Executive Director of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, where she has been since 2005. She serves as the Commission's spokesperson and also presents the Commission's works and recommendations at universities and various meetings, including the NCAA's Scholarly Colloquium. Let's see, I want to get to some other details here. She worked at the NCAA for more than 6 years and then at the University of Kansas as the Associate Athletics Director and Senior Woman Administrator. where she served on several Big 12 conference and NCAA committees. So she'll be filling us in on the activities and what the Knight Commission can offer education reporters covering the balance of athletics and academics. So to begin with, we are going to lead off with Jodi.
Thank you. I'm going to make my way over to the podium, but before I do that, I want to get the lay of the land here a little bit. How many of you played a varsity sport in college? Got a couple of hands. Good. Any of you D1? Excellent. How many of you have ever covered sports as a beat? A few more hands. And how many of you have one or two major universities that are part of your beat? Almost all of you. And how many of those are D1 schools? Fewer than I expected, but a few. Okay. So I want to talk about a couple of things today. One, the first thing I want to tell you is a story about why I became a sports reporter and why you should too. And then I'm going to tell you about a few documents you should be aware of that are out there. And then hopefully we'll be able to get the discussion into some of the changes in the NCAA and in the whole college athletic system that is probably going to bring you in as an education reporter, whether you like it or not. So you might as well be aware of it. So I ended up being a sports reporter. I was always a city-side reporter. I covered City Hall and business and the auto industry, all those kinds of things. And I was in South America, and I was looking for a job, and USA Today called, and they needed someone to do database analysis in their sports department. And I'd never covered sports before, and I'm like, it's sports. How hard can it be, right? It's all the same quote, and anyway. So let me start with the 3 lessons that I learned being a sports reporter. I now, as Kenneth said, I now run the database team. So I don't do sports exclusively, but I still do some of it. So when I got to USA Today in the sports department, I'm kind of a sports idiot. And 8 years later, I was still kind of a sports idiot. Either you have the gene or you don't. But there were still a lot of things that I wanted to learn while I was there. And the first lesson I learned when I started hanging out with the other reporters and covering athletes is that college athletes work really, really hard. And while we do a lot of stories about the knuckleheads that are always getting in trouble and beating up dogs and wives and then ending up with a $20 million NFL contract, most athletes really do work really hard, and as a group, they have higher graduation rates than the rest of the general public, than the rest of the university as a whole. So there were a lot of myths that I had to sort of overcome once I got there. The first really big story I started doing when I was there was I was hanging around talking to a couple of reporters, and they were talking about, Coach X had just gotten this 3-year, $3 million football contract, and that's even bigger than the $4 million 5-year contract. And I'm like, that's really cool. So which coach makes the most money? And they were like, probably one of those two. And I'm like, probably? I'm like, well, what's the average? And they're like, it was crickets. I'm like, you're kidding. You don't know how much public school football players are making? Football coaches are making? Sorry, yes. We really don't know that. We have some ideas, though. And they didn't. They really didn't know how much the coaches were making. So that was the second lesson I learned, which is that most sports reporters do not like to file FOIAs, and they do not like anything that is financial. They just don't like to deal with that stuff, which is why you guys can probably help them out. So I ended up getting 100. I ended up doing the open records requests for 100 contracts, 100 outside income reports. I'll tell you what those are in a minute. And I spent several months analyzing them to put all of the different kinds of money that coaches get into various buckets and making it comparable so I could say who made the most amount of money. And when I was done, I was like, yes, I am going to put the nail in the coffin of these really outrageous salaries. And that was when I learned lesson number 3, which is that if you're going to do these kinds of financial sports stories, don't expect anyone in sports in particular to really appreciate what you're doing. And I don't just mean the sports department, I mean sports readers as well. Because if you ever read the comments in a sports section, there is no amount of money that is too much for a favorite coach. So, given those lessons, that's sort of how I started. But let me give you a really basic primer. And the reason I'm giving you this is because if you do want to get into covering sports and the finances of college athletics, there's some real basic things you need to know. And if you've never really covered sports, some of this may be new to you. And let me also tell you that all of this is changing because of the O'Bannon lawsuits, because of a whole series of lawsuits that are coming through, because of the way the NCAA is looking at doing a split from the Big Five conferences. A lot of things are going to change. So basically, you have three major conferences, even within Division I. You've got those that play the high-level football, which has been called BCS. You've got the football championship subdivision, and then you've got the non-football schools. By the way, this PowerPoint will be available to you. You don't have to write any of this down. They're like, now you tell me. And there are three major differences in the divisions, 1, 2, and 3. And Amy has a little bit more information about how that is a philosophical difference. The only takeaway you really need to know is that it's not just about size. The Division I schools are obviously much, much bigger, and whether or not they play football is really going to tell you how big their athletics department budget is. But there's also other kinds of requirements, like how many scholarships, how many equivalency sports. An equivalency sport is one that you can break up. So if you're giving a student a scholarship, you can give them a half a scholarship. You can give them a 10% scholarship. A head count sports, which are the ones listed, are the ones you cannot split. They have to be whole scholarships. And then you get all the way down to Division III, and there are no scholarships at all. So a couple of documents you guys should be aware of. How many of you have ever looked at the Office of Post-Secondary Education's financial? It's their EADA report. Any of you ever looked at it? Any of you ever? Looks like 1 or 2 people. It is available. It is brought to you by the same people that have brought us the data that we've been complaining about all day long. So it has very many of the same problems. In fact, when I was early on, I was doing a story because I kept finding that there were huge discrepancies in schools, the way they were reporting things. Discrepancies of $30 million, which is a whole athletics department. And the quote I got from OPE was, "Ma'am, we just post the data and move on. We don't look at it." I'm like, well, then what good is it? The thing you have to know about this data is not only is it flawed in a number of ways, but there's one fatal flaw in my mind, and that is even though the Knight Commission has tried to make it better, and so is the NCAA actually, for some reason you cannot report expenses exceeding revenues. So thank you, federal government. You automatically wipe out everybody's debt because you have this really weird form that won't allow negative numbers. So that causes a huge problem. The only reason I would use this data, if you need it, is because it does include private schools. I think Brigham Young is the only one that is not on it. But everyone else is included in it. So if you cover a private school, it's about all you get, but it does give you some revenue information. What's better? All of the schools have to report to the NCAA a whole bunch of financial information. And the detail level is really kind of surprising. It is always sort of a candy store for me when I find a new NCAA report that is required from the schools. And there's a huge amount of reporting that has to be done. The only problem is the NCAA is not subject to open records, so you have to get it from the individual schools, and you can only get it from the public schools. So what does it look like? Let me just show you real briefly. This one is 26 pages. This is Rutgers in 2010. I want to direct your attention to a couple of things specifically. It tells you the number of undergraduates, what the percentage. It tells you, by the way, this is audited data. This is why it's much more valuable, and it's partly the Knight Commission that has sort of pushed to get this to be better data. It's not perfect, but it's much, much better than almost anything out there that we have. It allows you to especially compare a school over time, as well as, to some extent, schools with each other, especially if they're very similar schools, like in the same conference. But it gives you that big, long number. I don't know if you can see it. 2/3 of the way down the page is their revenues and expenses for the entire university. And then the next number is what actually goes to the instructional numbers. And then it gives you two ways of looking at how expensive it is to go to the university. One is the full grant and aid, and the other is the cost of attendance. The reason these are important are specifically because of the O'Bannon case and those that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And that is that if you're going to pay athletes, the cost of attendance number is likely the number that the schools are going to end up with. Now, there's some debate as to how that will actually shake out, but that's one of the numbers. And what is particularly interesting to me is a while ago we did a story looking at how the grant and aid compares to cost of attendance, because how many of you know the difference between this number? Okay. The basic difference is that when you're giving a scholarship, you give the grant and aid number, which is the room and board, the tuition, the basic stuff of going to school. Whereas the cost of attendance is, well, if you have to get to the school, how much is it going to cost you? If the school's in a really urban area, like UCLA or something, getting around, how much is it going to cost you? Do you need a computer? Do you need, pizza on a Sunday night? It's all those sort of extras that you really do have to pay in order to go to school. The differences between that number can be huge. I mean, in UCLA, I think the number is something like $2,000 difference. That's the differential that may be paid to athletes. In Utah, and I think it's in Orem, it's $6,000. Why does it cost $6,000 more in Utah? I don't know. And why this is also significant is because this is part of the tension between the athletics department and the rest of the university. The athletics department wants that number to be high if you are a really high-end school that wants to pay their athletes, and not all schools do. But if you want to really compete for the top athletes, you want that number to be high. The rest of the university does not want that number to be high. It wants it to be very low because it impacts the sticker price for tuition. So that's going to be increasingly a tension over the next year or two. And again, just briefly to show you what this form is, this tells you all of the sports that are offered. And anytime you're looking at the total amount of money that a school is spending on its athletics department, the things you need to keep in mind are how many sports do they offer and how many athletes do they have. Amy had this number, like Texas is 160 million and 19 sports, and Ohio State is like 100 million and how many?
33 sports.
And 33 sports. So, you can tell where that money is going. And then it gets into all the ways that they make that money. Ticket sales, contributions, what the state supports them with, all of that, what the university pays them directly, what the university pays them indirectly, all of that stuff is there. And I'll let you explore it on your own, but then they also tell you what they spend in scholarships, and then they break it down by sport. And the whole rest of the report is broken down in lots of revenue information. All right, so we have some of this information on our website, and the Knight Commission has a different version of some of it. As it says there are a couple of private schools that we cannot get. Pennsylvania has a weird open records law. Penn State, because of some of the problems they've had, have started giving this report over. If you ask for it, it doesn't really have a name, and this is where things get tricky. If you ask for the EADA report, which is kind of what this is, you'll get the federal EADA report, and you don't want that. The way I usually ask for it is the NCAA financial report that is due in January to the NCAA, and then I sort of describe it. And then one last thing I want to leave you with, and that is knowing the different kinds of revenue. If you want to look at your school and know if the athletics department is making money, you want to look at two different kinds of revenue. What is their generated revenue, which is everything that comes in to the athletics department from student fees to contributions, minus the allocated money that comes in with student fees, direct and indirect university support, and state support. And that's basically how the NCAA calculates that as well. I'm not going to go through all of these. This is supposed to include debt payments. It doesn't always. Schools do fudge things somewhat. And these are some of the stories to watch, but we have that seminar later, so I think I'm out of time. One other thing I would warn you about is this is not a budget. It is just a way of comparatively looking at expenses that are sort of on the same playing field, if you will. So if you walk into the athletics department and say, why are you spending this much on X? They might say, well, we're not really. And they're talking about their budget. So just be aware of that. Couple of other documents you should also be aware of. I mentioned earlier an OIR, which is an outside income report. Everybody in the athletic department is required to file once a year a form that says every bit of money they made in some kind of outside work that is related to sports. So if you sold a book, if you gave speeches, if you ran a camp that was not paid through the athletics department, all of that income has to be reported. If you did a TV advertisement, all of that income has to be reported. And then there's always the salary contracts, which are always really interesting, like who gets 16 hours on the university plane, how many of the coach's relatives get to go with him, stuff like that. So, all right, I will turn it over. Thank you.
Thank you, Jodi. Now we'll hear from Amy.
Great, thank you. Just a couple points about my background before I jump in on all this information. It was mentioned that I worked as a college administrator, athletic administrator. I also was a college athlete at Wake Forest University and had just tremendous experiences as an athlete as well as an administrator. And then I was decided I wanted to take a little bit of a turn and try out pro sports, and I was hired by the NBA to serve as its team president for its first ever minor league team. Some people don't even know minor league for the NBA actually exists, but it's been around since 2001, and it's called the D League. And one of our best players, who was actually then the first player ever drafted from a D League team to an NBA team, his name's Chris Anderson. And if you follow pro sports or follow the Miami Heat, I knew Chris Anderson when he only had one tattoo. So if you Google the Birdman, you will appreciate that comment a little bit more. But, I found in that experience, I think a famous philosopher once said that sometimes life makes more sense when you look at it backwards. Because during that year I was doing pro sports, I said, why am I doing this? And my passion really is in college sports and in education through sports. And so I stopped working with the NBA in that venture and really wanted to get back into college sports with a goal of doing what I can to really try to improve it and help to make it better. And was lucky then to begin working with the Knight Commission, whose goal from its beginning has been to emphasize the college in college sports. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about what we do, what resources we have that I think can be really helpful to you, and then touch on a couple of the hot topics that you may be covering. The Knight Commission is funded by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. We're an independent group comprised of college presidents, some former presidents, board of trustee members, and and some journalists as well. We've had as our membership Judy Woodruff, Sonia Steptoe, who did some terrific investigative reporting when she was an active journalist. And our co-chair is the president of this university, Gerald Turner, and you heard Dr. Turner speak last night. It was really a real treat for me to be able to hear him speak last night, because when I'm with him, we're always talking about college sports issues. So it was great to hear him talk about his day job and all the great things going on here at SMU. And on that point as well, we have a night commission meeting on Monday, and I'm going to touch on that as I get into this. The history, just a real brief background on the history. The commission was formed in 1989, and it really was formed because of the high-profile scandals going on at that time, as well as the low graduation rates for football and basketball players. And at that time, the presidents really felt that the integrity of higher education was threatened by all of this, and so they wanted to create a commission that would promote a reform agenda. What we do, we hold public meetings. As I mentioned, we will have a public meeting on Monday in Washington, D.C., and I know there are many of you here who are D.C.-based, and you're welcome to attend. We have a big crowd of, I know we have about 20 media already coming, and a lot of other folks from for other reasons, but we will not turn anyone away until they tell us we're at capacity. But at that public meeting, and at our public meetings, we really try to tee up the really important issues that are facing college sports. On our agenda Monday, we have the NCAA's Chief Medical Officer, who will be talking about the NCAA's research on concussions and also the other health and safety guidelines that have been issued. And then we also have 5 experienced leaders, including Oliver Luck, the athletics director at West Virginia, and a couple of conference commissioners talking about their ideas for new approaches for college sports. And there are certainly many issues going on, litigation that's driving a number of things that really could change the structure of college sports. And 5 years from now, 3 years from now, it may not even look anything like what it looks like right now, especially for Division I. And that's one point I want to diverge just a little bit. Jodi touched on, and it showed you a slide on the differences between Division I, II, and III. And I think it's really important to understand that because, with these issues and the headlines and the stories about college sports, it does get painted with a really broad brush. And our work, the Knight Commission's work, really has been focused on Division I. Division I is more than 350 schools, and they're incredibly diverse. Athletic budgets from $5 million all the way up to $165 million. Athletic departments with $5 million budgets competing against schools with $5 million coaches. So that particular division is just incredibly diverse. Division II is a bit smaller, and Division III is over 400 institutions. Division III really uses athletics to drive enrollment. If you look at athletic programs in the Northeast, you'll find a lot of equestrian programs. If you look at Division III programs in the Southeast, you'll find that they've added men's lacrosse and football like crazy in the past 10 years, and that's really been to drive male enrollment. And then Division I obviously has been more about the higher profile, the entertainment aspect of college sports. Moving on to, again, going back to the Knight Commission, we hold public meetings. We hold public meetings to keep pressure on for change. We've promoted different policy recommendations, governance recommendations, and I'm going to touch a bit on those as well. We also conduct research, and as Jodi mentioned, we have a database. I'm going to move over and give you a little test drive on that because I think it will really be beneficial to you. The reports we've produced began with 1991. It was considered a landmark report, and the basic recommendations and thrust at that time, it was a 1+3 model for college sports, and it was to put presidents in charge, and presidents focus on academic integrity, financial integrity, and an accountability process to verify that integrity. 10 years later, in 2001, the Commission issued another report, and a central recommendation in that report was that teams should have to graduate at least 50% of its players to be eligible for the championships. Now, at that time, and Terry touched on this in his presentation this morning, at that time the only metric or measurement for graduation rates is the federal government's graduation rate. And the pushback was that's not fair because it's a flawed measure in the way it counts transfers. So that recommendation in and of itself really helped push the NCAA to create its own accountability metrics and its own academic metrics. So the NCAA has what they call an academic progress rate and a graduation success rate that have been in place since 2004. And those have really strengthened the accountability and helped to improve the academic outcomes. Many of the Commission's recommendations in 91 were ultimately adopted by the NCAA, and they really did provide a roadmap for the academic reforms that have occurred over the past 2 decades. In 2010, we issued another report, and that report was framed around 3 primary principles. The first was financial transparency, creating better measures to compare athletics and academic spending. And we've heard a lot about transparency and that being mentioned here earlier. The Commission really felt that academic reform hit a tipping point when there was transparency for graduation rates in 1991 and when the federal government required the reporting of graduation rates. So the Commission believes that the same can hold true with finances. On the point of transparency as well, there has been an act introduced in the House of Representatives, the SCORE Act, and that would require more public disclosure of the types of data that Jodi referred to. The second principle that we promoted in our report is incentives, to address the incentives so they are aligned with the educational values. In college sports, you all know how much attention March Madness gets and the money that's involved with March Madness. And the Commission believed that, at a minimum, again, teams should have to, now using the NCAA's metrics, teams should have to be on track to graduate at least 50% of their players. And we really pushed that in 2010 when we released our report. But really what was the tipping point was Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, and that was mentioned earlier today in terms of his experience as a player and his passion for college sports. He really pushed that particular expectation and felt that was the right expectation for college sports. And that pressure, as well as the fact that there were several academic fraud scandals that occurred around that same time, really led to presidents putting a stake in the ground on that and saying, okay, we're going to push forward with that particular reform. So now teams do have to meet that standard using the NCAA's metrics that they're on track to graduate at least half their players to be eligible for the championships. After the first year that was introduced, University of Connecticut was banned from the tournament. We've also, and will continue to push changes in the revenue distribution and the $700 million that is distributed to the universities from the March Madness, as well as the nearly $500 million annual payout for the college football playoff. We have specific ideas about how we think those monies can be distributed to help strengthen the educational mission instead of the way they're currently distributed. The third reform of that report was to treat athletes as students first, not as professionals. And at the time we released the report in 2010, one of the specific recommendations, as an example, was to reduce the time demands on athletes. And when our report was released, it really didn't get, that particular recommendation did not resonate, didn't get very much attention, but it certainly has become a talking point recently, and we have more allies on that point now, and conference commissioners are talking about it. And certainly I think the NLRB regional director's decision in Northwestern that he ruled that those football players should be considered employees and have the right to unionize. And then you have the O'Bannon decision, and certainly those were critical factors in people, commissioners and other leaders saying, okay, we've got to reduce the time demands. So we all know that sometimes good ideas don't move anywhere unless there's external pressure, and there certainly has been a lot of external pressures applied in college sports of late. I'm going to walk over here and show you the database because it relates again to our efforts to help improve the transparency for athletics finances. If you want to, on your own computer, if you want to get ahead of me, on our website, there's a portal. If you click the portal, it goes straight to our athletic and academic spending database. And again, this is for Division I. And before I get started in showing you this, we owe a debt of gratitude for the great work that USA Today has done from the very beginning of, Jodi mentioned the reports that have changed over the years, but in 2005, the NCAA did change its financial report, and beginning with that time is when USA Today started collecting these reports. We have a partnership with USA Today for the athletics data that they collect, and then we work with the Delta Cost Project with the American Institutes for Research on the academic spending data. But the first thing I want to show you is on this database, if you go to the About page, kind of why this matters, I want to show you two graphs that I think really help anyone understand what's going on right now with Division I and the money. And this first graph says where the money goes, and basically the FBS is the first bar there. Those are all the big-time schools playing in the Football Bowl subdivision, 126 or so. And then you have them broken down by quartile. So you can see at the top quartile, at the bottom bar, their budgets range from 80 million to 139. And again, this was a 2012 graph, and that's already jumped up at the highest point to 160 million. The FCS is the schools playing for that FCS championship that is sponsored by the NCAA. Those budgets are 4 million to 35 million. And then the Division I no football, you can see there the budget's from 3 million to 24 million. You can see from the colors there's not a lot of difference between the proportions in their budget in terms of where the money goes, except that at the schools with the biggest budgets, the smaller amount goes towards scholarships. So the schools with fewer resources are spending a greater portion of their money, obviously, on scholarships. The big difference, and where you understand what's going on in Division I, is where the money comes from. And the most important thing to understand with this graph is that the red and the oranges show student fees or institutional funding. And this is the biggest difference between what USA Today collects and what we're showing and what you will find on the EAD, the government reports, because the EADA does not show how much money is coming from student fees or institutional funding. And that was a big issue that we pushed, the Knight Commission pushed the NCAA to revise its reports back in 2004 and 5 to more clearly show what's coming from students to support the programs because we believe that was important to show that transparency. So you can see here at the very high, the schools with the most resources there in quartile 1 and quartile 2 generate most of their revenues and rely very little on student fees. But as you can see, when you move to the right, those in the fourth quartile, those schools in the FCS, those in Division I no football, they're relying primarily on student fees. So this issue of, paying cost of attendance for athletes, for these schools it's philosophical. Are we going to charge our students more so we can now give the athletes more money? And those schools are not going to be able, in most cases, to do that. I want to jump back up here. I'm running out of time. I want to show you real quickly the custom reporting tool and just describe this. You can click around. You can get lost on this. You can get lots of information, but it gives you facts on academic spending trends over time, athletic spending trends over time, football spending trends over time. I took a call last week from a reporter who reports on bonds, and he was reporting on bonds just being sold by the University of Colorado, $300 million in bonds, $100 million going to stadium project. and he just wanted some context. And so I took him to this custom reporting tool, and just for context, had him click athletic spending per student, athletic spending per athlete, and then come down and just look at the FBS, which is Colorado's in the FBS. And then he wanted to look at the change over time for that. So we're going to adjust for inflation, click all this, include the graph, generate the report, and you can see there that in the FBS median for, let me go back because I forgot to click 2012. I saw that number and it didn't match up with what was in his article, so I knew it was wrong. So for academic spending per student in the FBS from 2005 to 2012 grew at a rate of 6%. Athletic spending per athlete grew at a rate of 40%. So that's for the schools in the FBS. And then he also wanted to know, okay, what's the athletic debt? He said, the university is saying they haven't renovated in a while and their competitors are way ahead of them. So we wanted to check that out. So we went in, and you can, find the school. His was University of Colorado Boulder, and he wanted to compare that. So the best comparisons for that would be the Big Five conferences, and Colorado is a member of the Pac-12. So we're not going to look at projections. And so what he was able to see is that athletic debt service on facilities, you look at the Big 12 conference has grown, 74% over that time. The Big 10 grew 176% over that time. His competitors in the Pac-12, 70%, and Colorado had been paying down in debt service and not have any new big projects. And then you can see the debt outstanding on athletics facilities, and you can see that Colorado had not been building anything, where the others, especially his competitors in the Pac-12, have a lot going on there. So I just wanted to show you that just as a tool that was used recently in the Bloomberg article piece, and just show you this so you can see how easy it is to utilize. Just one more note about the Big Five and what the stories are moving forward. The Big Five, just to throw a couple numbers out at you, the Big Five conferences, the median, and this is based on the recent NCAA report. The NCAA report on finances usually comes out during when everybody's taking vacation, so you really don't know what's out there, but it came out in August, and the median expense was $81 million, whereas for all the other FBS schools, which are members of 5 other conferences, that median is $28 million. So there's a $50 million difference, and that's one of the gaps. And then with all the other Division I schools that are much lower than that. So you can see the big gap between the haves and the have-nots, and what folks think may occur in terms of those schools really just being in their own division. In terms of what's to come, those Big Five schools, there's going to be billions of new revenues coming in based on media revenues in the college football playoff. This coming January is the first year of the college football playoff. And again, just to give you some numbers, this is based on Sports Business Journal reporting of all the contracts and the future revenues. In 2012, those 5 conferences, through their postseason football with the college football playoff and the media revenues, were at $856 million in 2012. In 2020, it will be $2.2 billion. So those huge revenues. So the big question is, how are those revenues being used to strengthen the educational mission of our universities? And the push, as you've seen in the headlines and the litigation, the push is, let's use those revenues to pay the players in football and basketball. So there have been, in what Joe Nocera had a piece just this morning, an op-ed that talks about coaches' salaries and some of his thoughts about the market issues. And he's written lots of columns, and he's squarely in what we would call the team market in terms of how to reform the NCAA through team market, the market approach of let's just pay the players. And we are squarely in team reform in terms of trying to maintain the college and college sports and trying to again, advance different ways for reforms. So I'm going to stop there. Turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Amy. And now we'll hear from Paul Ward. And while we prepare Paul's PowerPoint, I just had one quick question for Amy. You mentioned in your presentation about how the reform went through for the University of Connecticut, where we were talking about graduation rates, and then a few years later, their basketball team was ineligible for the tournament because their students weren't graduating enough. That was a pretty quick turnaround. I think it was just 3 or 4 years, was it, or was it longer than that?
What, in terms of?
Of when the NCAA began gathering the.
Well, the metric that's used to hold them out of the tournament is an academic progress rate, which is a real-time measurement.
Okay.
And then you have the graduation success rate, which, again, you wait till those classes. It runs along with the federal government grad rate kind of calculation in terms of, 6-year window, and you got some lag time. So that tournament ban is based on kind of the real-time measure of being on track to graduate half your players.
Great, thank you. I think Paul is ready.
Ready to go. Well, good afternoon. Again, my name is Paul Ward. I serve as General Counsel at SMU, and I am delighted to be with you this afternoon. I was in a program at SMU in the law school a couple of months ago, and a new faculty member who is the former research director at the National Security Agency, NSA, got up to speak, and he said, "Gee, I'm so glad to be here. I've been reading your email for years, and it's so nice to put a face with all that email." And so I'm thinking about those letters I received requesting coaching contracts and athletically related income, and I can put a face now, Jodi, with those letters. And so that's a pleasure. Also, I can't think of any other time in 35 years as a chief legal officer at a university that I've met with a group of reporters that hasn't been part of some hastily scheduled press conference to announce a new coach or worse. So, again, I'm delighted to be here. In my time with you this afternoon, I'm going to take the subject of the interplay between athletics and academics and put it in the context of student disciplinary proceedings. And if I was told I have 8 to 10 minutes, so if you're interested in a longer version, in the spring semester, there's a 4-hour version of this, and I was really impressed that I got it down to 20 minutes, and this morning I was told make it 8 to 10. So I like to include this letter. In fact, I think there's a quote that I'm going to get to in the second page that should have been incorporated into the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. But the story here is that Thomas Jefferson, while he was building the University of Virginia, sent his 2 nephews to South Carolina College. And an early president of South Carolina College was Thomas Cooper. And so in this letter, he's writing Thomas Cooper, and he says, "I have heard with regret of disturbances on the part of the students in your seminary. The article of discipline is the most difficult in American education. Premature ideas of independence, too little repressed by parents, beget a spirit of insubordination which is the great obstacle to science with us and a principal cause of its decay since the Revolution. I look to it with dismay in our institution as a breaker ahead, which I am far from being confident we shall be able to weather." Now, I don't know if Socrates or Aristotle had problems with student behavior, but clearly this is not a phenomenon limited to the 20th and the 21st century, because here we are in 1822. So, one of my objectives is to do as few cases as possible. There are only 2. There's going to be 1 statute, and there's 1 more quote from Mr. Jefferson. First case, General Order, 1968, and let me put this in pretext. From the founding of Harvard College, 1636, until the earliest part of the 20th century. There was almost no litigation involving higher education, and a great degree of deference given to colleges and universities in the manner in which they treated everyone, employees, students, business relationships. In the early part of the 20th century, in loco parentis became recognized, and so that means that colleges and universities were standing in the shoes of parents. And so again, for a period of another 5 or 6 decades, colleges and universities were given significant amount of deference in the management of those relationships. Then with the Vietnam War and consumerism and litigious society and a whole number of factors coming together, in loco parentis starts to fade away, and we have the development of constitutional due process, the Dixon decision, a counterpart called institutional due process at private universities. And while those are very fundamentally different legal constructs, it's remarkable how similar institutions, private and public, operate in terms of administering student disciplinary proceedings. But in 1968, student disciplinary proceedings are not criminal in nature, as they only regulate the relationship between the student and the university and have no bearing on a student's legal rights or obligation under state or federal criminal law. 1 year later, Esteban versus Central Missouri State. This is later became Mr. Justice Blackmun. School regulations are not to be measured by the standards which prevail for criminal law and for criminal procedure. And so colleges and universities were developing models to administer student disciplinary decisions that, frankly, did not track criminal proceedings. In fact, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. The goals of the criminal justice system, which is administered by the state in Dallas County, the district attorney, the goals are punishment, retribution. A civil law system an objective is compensation for the victim. But at most universities, an educational development model developed where we were trying to create a good living, learning environment for all members of the academic community because an unsafe campus is an unsound learning environment. And so universities consciously moved away from language that is found in the criminal justice system and developed a separate language because these are very different quasi-judicial proceedings, not judicial proceedings. One of the themes I would like to leave you with is that this is a very fluid legal environment. Adam Malloy this morning talked about Title IX. She gave you the nutshell version of Title IX. This is the unabridged version of Title IX. 38 words. 38 words. And as she said, for the most part, the first 20 plus years, it was focused on gender equity in interscholastic and intercollegiate sports. The law hasn't changed. In the meantime, we have regulations. Regulations are promulgated pursuant to a notice and comment process. We have guidance. Guidance in the late 90s, again in 2001, waning hours of the Clinton administration. Guidance promulgated pursuant to a notice and comment process. Subsequent to that, we have what is referred to as sub-regulatory guidance. And sub-regulatory guidance is guidance that's not by Congress, not by notice and comment process. It's the Dear Colleague letter, April of 2011. It's the questions and answers document, April 29, 2014. So the standards by which charges of discrimination under Title IX are to be evaluated are subject to, what am I saying, fluid legal environment. Law has been in place for 42 years, the regulations for most of that time, the guidance over time, but as late as April 29, on page 30, in footnote 30, there is a statement from the Office of Civil Rights that universities discourage, that the OCR discourages universities from putting students on disciplinary panels. Well, at SMU, we have a tradition of students actively involved in the governance, a voting student on the trustee, a student on every committee of the Board of Trustees. So that is an issue which universities will need to consider, and whether or not that guidance is something to be incorporated into their disciplinary procedures. But what is important about sub-regulatory guidance is that even if it's not the law, and if it's not the regulations, it is the yardstick. It is the glimpse into the eyes of the regulators of how charges will be investigated and whether or not institutions will be found to be in compliance or not with Title IX. So back to focus on the very different kinds of things that can come up, again, interplay between athletics and academics. There are issues that only the athletics department worries about, and those are team rules. Now, it could be managed at the team level, generally is, sometimes managed at the departmental level, the athletics department level. Whether or not student athletes attend mandatory study hall, whether or not they observe curfew, whether or not they have, and they may have different formulations of this, but exhibiting a positive attitude and serve as a role model in the community. Then there are issues which are governed at the university level, the student code of conduct. So if there's damage to a residence hall, vandalism, that is something that is outside of athletics. Could be a student athlete, could be any student, but it's managed through a university disciplinary process. And then, of great concern, academic misconduct, plagiarism, cheating on tests. So those issues are managed not in athletics, whether or not it's a student athlete, it's managed at the university level. And here again, the courts are more deferential on matters of academic misconduct because they want to defer to the universities on whether or not it was plagiarism, whether or not. And less deferential on other matters, and particularly whether or not the institution has followed its own rules. And so a court would be quick to say that if the process is not followed, whether it's constitutional due process or institutional due process, then that the court will overturn whatever it was or remand it back for further consideration. Then there are issues of primary concern to the NCAA. And just a few of those, extra benefits. So if a student athlete frequents a restaurant or a clothing store or any place else and is provided something of value that is not made available to all other students, extra benefit. And that is something that would be disciplined through the NCAA compliance process. And you've read about very egregious situations and not so much. Amateurism. Amateurism is one of the issues that, as was just described, is under the microscope. And whether or not student athletes should be paid. Well, by definition, you're no longer an amateur if you're getting paid. But other examples of that, and it often arises in the context of world-class athletes competing in international competitions and being given something of value or prize money, and whether or not that then adversely affects their eligibility to participate in university athletics. And sports wagering, something that could not be more important to the NCAA in terms of the integrity of the sport. And so if a player is missing a basket at a key moment and throwing a game and gambling, but it also covers all athletics personnel and covers all student athletes on any sport in which the NCAA offers a championship. So I don't think there's a highlight university level college student athletes can bet on highlight. They can bet on horse racing, but they can't bet on in any sport, even at the NFL or the professional level, if there is a championship at the university level. And so then, lastly, there's that group, university and NCAA, where they overlap. And that means that you might have a single fact situation which is both the subject or object of a institutional disciplinary proceeding and one that becomes subject to a compliance proceeding through the NCAA. And examples are academic fraud that impact the initial eligibility of a prospective student athlete. Did the person have someone else take the SAT for him or her, or an issue of that sort? And then financial aid. If financial aid is revoked for whatever reason through an institutional process, the NCAA requires that the student athlete have the ability to avail himself or herself of a process outside of athletics that is available to all other students in that same circumstance. And so, a couple of concluding points. The difficulties. I went looking yesterday for an update on the fact situation at the University of Oklahoma involving a football student athlete. And before I found it, I came across a story in USA Today. At Florida State University has opened a formal disciplinary investigation of quarterback James Winston stemming from a 2012 incident in which he allegedly sexually assaulted another student. Walt Bogdanich of the New York Times reported Thursday that school officials interviewed the woman in August to ascertain her side of the incident, which she reported to authorities nearly 2 years ago. We thought it went very well, the victim's attorney, John Clune, told the Times. The school seemed to take it very seriously. Winston, who won the 2013 Heisman Trophy and led the Seminoles to a BCS national championship as a freshman, is alleged to have sexually assaulted the woman on December 7, 2012. Winston's family advisor was quick to fire back with a statement. The real story here is that after her Colorado attorneys created a media frenzy alleging Florida State failed to comply with its Title IX obligation, Ms. Name Redacted had to come clean and admit she had previously refused to cooperate with the university's Title IX. I think that fact pattern could end up on a law school exam in the next year or two. And the point is that there, as we heard this morning, a number of very complicated public policy and legal issues, which, as I've said, are subject to continuing evolving legal standards and analysis. And so I'd like to close with another quote from Thomas Jefferson. I think this is the 19th century version of the 80-20 rule. We wished to trust very much to the discretion of the students themselves for their own government. With 4/5 of them, this did well. But there were 15 or 20 bad subjects who were disposed to try whether our indulgence was without limit. Now, in that case, 4 students were expelled and a number of others were suspended from the institution. And not every university has the luxury that the University of Virginia did in its first Student Conduct Board, which was staffed by 3 former presidents of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and James Madison. Now, I didn't cover everything that was in the thing, but I'd be happy to take questions on that or other subjects as you all deem fit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. I think we have time for just 1 or 2 questions. Were there any out there?
My question is for Mr. Paul Ward. UTA is currently creating a contract with Learfield Sports, and I was wondering what is it that Learfield does for SMU, and how, if and how that will take away any student opportunities as far as like broadcasting, and also what are some of the positive and negative effects of putting our sports into these third-party programs?
In a court, that would be a compound question. Okay, Learfield Sports is an organization, and there are several competitors, where institutions outsource their marketing. And so they bundle all of their rights, broadcast rights, and otherwise for corporate sponsorships. This is sometimes done in-house, sometimes it is done through a third party, and presently at SMU it is conducted through a third party, Learfield Sports. Institutions at Arizona State as well as at SMU have gone back and forth on that, and it remains to be seen which is the more effective model, but it's an outsourcing of corporate sponsorships and broadcast rights.
What kind of effects does doing this give to our students?
You know, I hadn't thought of it in that context because you see marketing activities at games where I know students are involved. Whether there would have been more involvement if it had been in another model, I just couldn't say. But you know, it's a university, and so universities look for every opportunity to involve students in their business activities.
Can I add to that?
Yes, please.
I'm not speaking at all for SMU or even specifically for Learfield Sports, but that is a really important thing to start paying attention to, because a lot of the schools that are making a fair amount of money are turning to organizations like Learfield and others to handle all of those contracts. And you're right to ask the question, is this benefiting the students or is it benefiting the university? Now, I don't think Learfield was involved in this particular one, but there have been other cases where a university turned over, I'm not sure what the phrase would be for it, but like banking access. So there was only one type of ATM on campus, or there was only one type of credit card that was offered on campus. And that begs the question, is that the best opportunity for students? So it's a good question.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank our panelists for participating in this discussion.